Our guest today is Dr. Khaled Abou El Fadl, who's one of the world's leading authorities on Sharia, Islamic law, and Islam, and a prominent scholar in the field of human rights. He is the Distinguished Professor of Law at the UCLA School of Law, where he teaches about international human rights and Islamic jurisprudence, among other topics. I had the great good fortune of being on a panel with Professor Abou El Fadl recently at Georgetown University, and really, it made me really eager to continue the conversation and to learn more from him. I am not a scholar of Judaism in the way that Dr. Abou El Fadl is a scholar of Islam. I'm just a journalist who has an interest in the subject, as someone who tries to live a Jewish life and is interested in my own tradition. But I felt in the presence of Dr. Abou El Fadl that I was with someone who was really profoundly, deeply steeped in questions of Islamic ethics and the relationship to human rights. And it especially made me want to talk to him in this moment of crisis on so many fronts. So, Khaled, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always nice to see you again.
And people, as always, who put questions in the chat, and I'll happy to convey some of them. So I guess maybe we could start with the question of Gaza, that I know that you have been profoundly concerned about and troubled by. And if you could talk a little bit about, one of the things that I've been very engaged in trying to think about is what Gaza means, from what kind of crisis and tests it poses for Jews and even for Judaism. And I'd love to ask you how you think about this crisis and this destruction in Gaza in terms of what tests it and challenges and obligations it should impose it creates for Muslims, and what the right kind of framework, ethical, spiritual framework is for Muslims to see this horrifying destruction of an entire society.
I mean, it is quite notable from just I think any Muslim of conscience would notice that over 1 billion Muslims in the world, and they are either unable or unwilling to halt a full-scale genocide against a, 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 a population of 2 million people in a highly densely populated area, that anyone who has anything to do with the human rights field knew that long before the genocide in Gaza started, was already a highly problematic issue for human rights, meaning that people living there were living in an open air prison with numerous human rights violations occurring all the time. But I mean, for Muslims, the fact that it underscores a very serious problem with, uh, shall I say, leveraging either the non-existence of Muslim power or the problem with the leveraging of Muslim power. And for me, what it really underscores is the extent to which the gap between those that rule Muslims, that are in positions of leadership in Muslim countries, the enormous gap between their priorities, the way they see the world, the way they react to the world, and the populations that they rule over. In a word, despotism. Um, I mean, you can the sentiment of, I would dare say that if there was anything remotely like a democratic system or democratic systems in much of the Muslim world, the reactions of Muslim countries would be quite different. At a minimum, I mean, you have now a genocide that has been going on for quite a while, and not a single one of these countries that have um, uh, dares to call its ambassador from Israel, or dares to suspend trade with Israel, or dares to really take any even an affirmative position, even remotely resembling what South Africa did in the International Court of Justice. Um, I mean, it's sort of the since colonialism, it was commonly known among Muslim intellectuals that Muslim leaders rule the relevant constituency has always been the former colonial powers, whether the former colonial powers are France, Britain, the US, Russia. Um, uh, these were the relevant constituencies. These were the people that they really cared about. The 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 opinions that they thought were relevant as to the people they actually ruled over. These sort of masses that they rule over, they mattered very little. But I think Gaza underscored this in a truly undeniable way. And it also underscored a crisis in and a deep fissure in understanding of Islamic morality and the role that Islamic morality plays. Um, what is Islam about? Is Islam just about doing your rituals, praying 5 times a day, fasting Ramadan, going to Hajj, um, practicing the rituals correctly, or is does Islam demand a form of an ethical modeling of Muslims? How could Muslims tell the world that they stand for a moral idea if they are complicit in murdering fellow Muslims? I mean, it's a paradox of deeply troubling proportions.
Can you say something about what you think were the factors that have led us to these kinds of regimes that exist in, maybe not in all, but in many Muslim majority countries?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is quite um, complicated, but what uh, sort of part, I mean, and here I hope I not, it's just part of the since colonialism, we've had a socio-political dynamic that had stayed and festered and became worse and worse with the passage of time, not resolved in any real fashion. Uh, there is an elite that, and I do emphasize that this is sort of a pattern that has emerged in in colonialism generally, an elite that sees itself as the if you will, as the guardians of modernity. That elite sustains itself by cooperating with the foreign colonizer. Quite often in countries like Egypt or Syria or Iraq, or that elite uh, is secularized, um, uh, intellectually, if you will, uh, um, more. intellectually and culturally. Their mores, their norms, their values are more consistent with those who provide that elite with training and weapons and their worldview. In other words, their colonizers. Um, and that role that they see themselves in as the sort of very much what the role that the colonizer self used to play, as sort of guardians against reactionism, the guardians against barbarism, the guardians against a sliding back into history where uh, but what that often means is that they play that guardianship role very forcefully and through coercion, through sheer political repression. So, I mean, take for example, just to bring the idea closer, what happened in Egypt after the Arab Spring. The military, as many observers were predicting, the military was going to be extremely uncomfortable with the idea of free elections, or the idea that the populace can govern itself in any meaningful way, with the idea that there would be any type of oversight over that. And it's not just the military, but the military and its supporters, which meant the military, the judiciary, which classically have played that sort of guardianship role, uh, all security related forces. It's not just a distrust of religion, but it's a distrust of native culture as dangerous and as reactionary, and as, I mean, you would often hear statements like, "Oh, if people are left to govern themselves, they're going to take us back to the days of camels and donkeys, and they're going to take us back to the days where." To the Stone Age days. And as predicted, the military launches a coup in which they play that guardianship role. Now, the irony, same pattern we see repeatedly. This elite, quite typically, because there's quite a bit of corruption, the elite often sends their kids to get an education in Western countries. Whether Western countries here, I would include even Russia or Czechoslovakia, or in the old days Yugoslavia, or the United States or France or Britain. They get their degrees, their education from these countries. They come back home. They are, through nepotism, they are going to take all the leadership positions, and they look at their own people, the people they rule over, with a great deal of suspicion and fear, um, and arrogance at the same time, because they see themselves as enlightened, and everyone else, meaning the commoners, as unenlightened, as backwards. So, so you end up with something very strange, that, like the Egyptian government is fully complicit in the genocide in Gaza. I mean, and the disconnection between their norms, their morality, and the people that even allowed them to exploit the suffering of their brethren, their own tribe in Palestine, by extorting money from them in order to allow any Gazans that want to leave Gaza has to pay the Egyptian military $5,000 to $10,000. That would not, if you had any form of accountability, that would not happen. In Saudi Arabia, the disconnect has led to, uh, you know, uh, or the Emirates, maybe even a better example, to a very strange disassociation from the suffering of fellow Palestinians to the extent that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that for these despots, they wish that any they wish that the Palestinian problem would just go away and just vanish because it gets in the way of the leisures of life that they're accustomed to enjoying. They see the Palestinians just as they would see any issue of real self-determination, uh, any demand that has to do with dignity, self-fulfillment, historical normativities as an inconvenience and as a problem that they would just want to wave away. Um, it gets into the way of the business of ruling as they see fit.
Seems to me some of the most powerful opposition to these regimes in recent years has come from Islamist movements and organizations. And so I wonder, and obviously there's a tremendous amount of discussion about those in the West. So I wonder if you can talk about how you, from how you see the Muslim Brotherhood, from which Hamas is an offspring. Hamas is, and, um, and what you think as and then of course more radical, so-called jihadi organizations like Al Qaeda and ISIS, all of whom are opposed to these regimes. But to what degree do you think they are they to from your perspective, as someone who studies Islam from the perspective of human rights, how do you evaluate these Islamist rebellions or alternatives to these authoritarian regimes?
No, I mean the problem. The picture is complicated. Uh, the thing about human rights um, is that uh, human rights is is real, becomes real in practice. And what I mean by this is that it is very easy, and this is the 30 years of experience in the field of human rights has really taught me that it is easy for anyone to affirm human rights in principle. Nearly everyone does. Even the most egregious monsters will affirm some version of human rights or another. But the human rights is a, if you will, a normative practice, even becomes a cultural practice that can only really develop in uh, in real application. I mean, because it, you need to train, as you describe, for instance, in your book on Gaza, you need to train on how to approach the world of meaning and values in a non-narcissistic way. You need to actually train on how to value your feelings as equal to the feelings of others. And it's not enough to just affirm it in principle. You need to train on how to stand uh, the challenge of fear and not resort to torture. And you can affirm this a million times in theory, but it's meaningless unless it's tested. And I see this as very relevant to the problem, to the whole issue of Islamic movements and Islamic groups, is that um, there you point out in your book where you're talking to a friend, and you tell your friend that you see him as a fanatic whose fanaticism is still useful for Jews in general, because this fanaticism has helped to protect Jews. And I remember I made a comment to you that, well, the situation is very different in the Muslim world, because the situation is a zero-sum game with fanatics. We In the Muslim world, fanatics get arrested, they get tortured, they get obliterated, or alternatively, if they have the opportunity to, if they have the chance, they'll obliterate others. So it's always a zero-sum game. And that zero-sum game has had nothing short of disastrous consequences on modern Muslim culture. Um, because it has never allowed, and I think the vast majority of Muslim intellectuals would agree, Muslim intellectuals who are not who still care about the Islamic culture or Islamic values and so on, is that the huge challenge is that it is very difficult to develop a theology of uh, normative values, humane values, in a zero-sum game like this. So uh, the the picture gets very complicated, right? Because um, the irony that while in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the 90s, it would have been fairly accurate to say that all Islamic groups are opposed to the despotic governments in power. Um, Today, we have rather an odd situation where a number of Islamic movements have been co-opted by these despotic governments, especially in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt. Some of the very famous Jama'at Islamiyah, they have been co-opted by the authoritarian Egyptian government, where they actually support the despot. Um, and these governments have worked quite in the process of trying to co-opt these movements. There was a very deliberate effort to theologically develop the theological apologetics for despotism and for political quietism in a particular way, that to justify the idea that it is far more important to learn how to do your ablutions before prayer in the correct way than to stand to stand for justice and to oppose a social injustice. The Muslim Brotherhood, uh, um, in particular, um, because they again they present a very complicated picture, because the Muslim Brotherhood, as you see in Hamas, is very different than the Muslim Brotherhood in most other countries. In Hamas is, as I understand, I mean, I'm not an expert on Hamas, so as I understand, Hamas is sworn to uh, militant resistance. But the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Jordan, in Tunisia have very uh, have gone out of the way repeatedly to say that they have abandoned violent means of opposition. And the irony is that in all these countries, the reason that the Muslim Brotherhood, in particular, uh, are uh, are despised by governments like the Egyptian government, the Tunisian government, the Saudi governments, Emirati government, is because they are the one Islamic organization that, at least theologically, have made attempts to reconcile between democratic values and Islamic theology. And so the Egyptian, Jordanian, Tunisian example uh, are it's very risky to draw any parallels between them and the example in Gaza or in Palestine, that uh, because the Muslim Brotherhood in these other contexts are the one Islamic group that, while rejecting militancy, have at the same time, at least again, and things you can't really believe things unless you see them in practice. At least in theory, have said that there's no inconsistency between democracy and Islamic theology. For the Emiratis and Saudis and Egyptians, that makes them particularly dangerous, and that underscores the hostility to the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, having said this, and again, because this is often um, it is often used as an ideology for repression and political despotism by uh, secularists in Islamic society. So I'm careful about how I say this, but let's put it this way. I think that there's a serious deficiency among all Islamic movements when it comes to the issue of human rights. Um, I think the theology of human rights is not nearly near the development of where it should be, but the main problem is that there is no learning that came from actual attempts and failure, practice. I think a day in the field will teach you far more about human rights than reading 10 books. And so the deficiency among Islamic groups is grossly underscored by the authoritarian practice in which they all have to develop in.
If someone came to you, and I suspect maybe some have, a Muslim comes and says, how should I make sense of what happened on October 7th? On the one hand, obviously, Palestinians were under a condition of very severe repression, in Gaza in particular. And yet this was an attack that also seems to have not just take against soldiers, but have targeted civilians for killing and for abduction. From a perspective of kind of Muslim ethics of war, how do you make sense of what happened on October 7th?
Well, I mean, any student of Muslim law would know that it is strictly prohibited to target civilians. But again, I mean, that's the thing about theology, is that uh, and dealing with God's law, is that human beings have an amazing capacity to justify whatever they want to justify. Whether it's arguments of necessity, or which is often how religious law gets skewed and gets corrupted. But how to make sense of it? The way I I understand it, and again, I should put into a caveat, is that I've learned again from a long history of practice in the human rights field, is that it is very dangerous to draw conclusions until you've had an opportunity for people to actually research the facts. So, I mean, I just want to put this disclaimer in, that I still want objective investigation of what happened precisely, and who the victims were, and what atrocities and violations were committed. Because all sides are claiming uh, uh, all types of things and are heavily charged. But I do, I mean, the evidence, uh, the, there seems to be sufficient evidence that civilians were targeted, civilians were hurt, and that violations were committed. And that's, of course, morally and theologically a huge problem. And the 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 way I understand it is not just the fact of a prolonged repression, and that, I mean, it has become so regular to hear every week of uh, shootings and arrests and brutalization of this population under occupation. But my guess is that the leadership at Hamas uh, clearly read the trajectory of things, that they were becoming uh, not just marginalized, but they were sort of disappearing from the from the radar. That um, Saudi Arabia was getting ready to sign an accord was Israel. It looked like Saudi Arabia was, everyone was basically rushing to the table to make peace with Israel and ignore Palestinians and ignore everything they had affirmed to that point, that we will not make peace with Israel unless Israel gives Palestinians even a measure of their rights, or even the rights that Israel had committed to under the Oslo Accords. It was quite clear that the uh, Morocco and Bahrain and the Emirates and Sudan and so on had all abandoned this position. Um, and I think that the the U.S. administration had taken that very dangerous step of recognizing Jerusalem as uh, all of Jerusalem as belonging to Israel and as Israel's capital, and sort of uh, basically leaving nothing on the table for. And Palestinians were basically looking at a history of being doomed to oblivion, being doomed to living in this open air prison in Gaza, while they are a priority on no one's table. Uh, and I think that, um, and I should add another thing from a Muslim's perspective, that Muslims who cared were constantly, um, it's not an exaggeration to say that your census was being assaulted and regularly offended by the offenses being committed against the Aqsa Mosque. That this was a pretty much a weekly thing, that now it had become a regular occurrence for Israeli security to accompany militants uh, who are treated very differently in Israel that than militants would be treated anywhere else, accompanied in violating the sanctity of the Aqsa Mosque, and these repeated offenses and the heightened anxiety that we are coming close to the time that the Aqsa Mosque is going to actually have the fate of the mosque in Khalil, where the time is divided between Jews and Muslims and so on. Um, and I think that the way I understand it is that Hamas basically did something in which they intended to turn to sort of just ruin the entire game for everyone. It's if you are going to forget us now, I know Hamas again, and I'm not an expert on Hamas, but what my understanding of this organization is that in the past their actions have usually been calculated and measured, In other words, you could see, so something seems to have gotten out of they've lost control somehow, somewhere. And that's where I really don't know what the full facts are. I've read somewhere that Hamas, or that that Hamas had information that Netanyahu planned to strike against them, so they struck preemptively. Um, who knows? Who knows what the reality are? But it's clear that there was an act of desperation. It's clear to me that there is this a, a, a little bit of an air of suicidality, if you will, in this act of desperation. Um, but I mean, regardless, I think that uh, uh, like when we had the whole issue with suicide bombings, I think it's very risky, very dangerous when an organization um, claims that it is a religious organization in some fashion. Um, I mean, and then commits acts um, that would send a message that somehow God's law is limitless and that God's law would support uh, atrocities.
I wanted to turn to the question of what it's like to be a prominent critic of Muslim regimes in the United States. One of the things that really struck me that I've heard about you, and that I experienced when we talked, was the consequences that you face for being such a public critic of Muslim of authoritarian Muslim regimes in the United States. What influence do such regimes have in Muslim American communities, and what is it like? What has it been like for you to be such a public critic of them?
The thing that I think would surprise a lot of people is that the atmosphere of um, the legacies of despotism, that sort of the generational trauma from despotism is alive and well among Muslim communities in the United States, and I think more broadly in the West. So um, the thing that is really striking is that the number of Muslim organizations in the United States um, that live in absolute terror of politics generally, and as a result, um, see someone who is a critic like myself as a troublemaker and as a potential source of unpredictable problems where it makes a difference practically. I mean, it's sort of in so there's a serious part of it that, for instance, if you tolerate a critic of Saudi Arabia, it probably means that your organization, um, you and your family will not be able to go to Hajj in Saudi Arabia, um, will not be able to go to Dubai if that's your thing. But beyond that, there's a part that's not so serious. That, for instance, if you're Egyptian, that you're possibly tolerating a critic of Egyptian despotism will have consequences as to your ability to visit back home if you're Egyptian, or perhaps your family back home. So, what that has often meant is outspoken people like myself about the dangers of, or the problem of despotism and abysmal human rights records of many of these countries find themselves quite ostracized and isolated in their own communities. Um, so, I mean, I mentioned to you earlier that our congregational prayer has a fairly small group, um, and in this has a lot to do with the fact that, excuse me, in our sermons we talk about political things very openly, and that severely limits the number of people that will attend our congregational prayers.
Does that have you, for instance, been able to go on a Hajj to Mecca given your public criticism of Saudi Arabia?
That would be very dangerous. No, I have not, um since the 90s. I have not been able to step foot in Saudi Arabia, and I wouldn't be able to travel to most Muslim countries at this point. Um, Definitely, I'm of Egyptian origins. I wouldn't be able to go to Egypt. Um, every once in a while, there in the human rights field, will hear of uh, an arrest, um, where someone has made the mistake of going to. Recently, there's Qaradawi's son. Qaradawi is a very prominent Muslim, late Qaradawi, prominent Muslim theologian. His son, who's a Turkish, has Turkish citizenship, was traveling in Lebanon, and in a horrendous precedent, uh, the Lebanese detained this fellow and turned this fellow over to the Emiratis, to the Emirati government, where um, where this fellow has disappeared, with just horrendous reports about what happened to him after his detention. Excuse me. So my point is that it's often dangerous to travel to many parts of the Middle East because of the human rights practices of these countries.
How, as I understand it, going on Hajj is a very serious religious obligation. So how do you, first of all, that must be immensely painful for you to not be able to do that. And how do you weigh this religious obligation to go on Hajj versus your moral obligation to speak out against authoritarianism?
Uh, I mean, in my view, um, the moral obligation. I mean, it is really. Put. I can't give priority to um, a personal fulfillment over. So the choice is: do I go? do I do I avail myself of something, yes, that I would very much love, and that is to go to Mecca and and see. Do I go to Mecca and which, of course, something that I long for, Eh, or do I speak out about what I see as the entire fate and destiny of Muslims? I mean, and what Islam stands for. In my view, uh, and again, your book mentions this, Peter. that the problem was the savagery and brutality that we encounter among Muslims repeatedly, the savagery and brutality that is brought about by dictatorship and despotism and lack of accountability and horrible human rights records, is that it, whether we like it or not, it has the effect of cheapening the value of Muslim life. It has the effect of giving fodder to the Islamophobic industry, of fueling Islamophobia. And when that happens, it indirectly enables the genocide in Gaza, because, as you pointed out in your book, the average Israeli has their fears and prejudices affirmed by saying, well, if these people can do this to one another, if these people can brutalize one another in this fashion, what will happen if I give them equal rights? Are they going to brutalize me as a Jew? And so that personal moral choice in which all types of Muslims choose to stay quiet and to play nice, so just so they can go to Hajj, just so they can have their summer home in Egypt, just so they can go shopping in Dubai. But the collective, cumulative cost for Muslims and for humanity at large is abhorrent. Uh, I personally think that choice has led to the Bosnian genocide, has led to the genocide in Burma, the genocide against the Rohingyas, has led to the genocide against the Uyghurs in China, and has led to the genocide in Gaza. In other words, the demonization of what a Muslim is. And when you demonize a people, it becomes possible to exterminate them and to kill them without it really becoming a crippling blow to your conscience. You justify the brutalization of a people. And to me, no, there is no way I can put my personal interest in going to Hajj as a priority. Um, and I don't know how God can accept it from me. If I go in the hereafter and tell God, "Oh yes, yeah, I played nice and I went to Hajj and I did my rituals," to just say, "Oh yeah, I put that ahead," but these patterns that we've seen over and over, uh, 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 where there's constant cycle of Muslims are demonized in some fashion, as uh, and then somehow they are not seen as fully human, and we see that every time we look. Uh, how many of us have lost sleep over the death counts, for instance, in Yemen? We hear of a recent bombing. We hear 30 civilians killed. Emotionally, we don't react to that the way we react to 30 civilians dead in France or 30 civilians dead uh, in the United States. And and I would submit to you that this is all because of the history of brutalization that we've all grown accustomed to since colonialism.
You said something at our Georgetown event. Maybe this will be the last question. That was so much of what you say resonates with me and my struggles as a Jew in trying to just make decisions about religious practice and the ethical challenges. But you also said something else in our event at Georgetown that really struck me. You said something like, when young American Muslims, maybe particularly young American Muslims, ask you for advice about how to behave, you tell them not to listen to their parents, which for many Jews may yeah, will be very resonant in some ways, given the generational divide over Israel among American Jews. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you meant by that, the generational divide, and how you hope young American Muslims will change the nature of American Muslim life.
Uh, Um, there is a lot of generational trauma among, in my view, among Muslims in the United States. Generational trauma, and as a father now, my children are grown men, but when I've long reflected about the way I see the world, the way I react to the world, um, the way my generation sees and reacts to the world, the the effects of generational trauma that even someone like myself who has made every effort not to allow despotism to uh, 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 deform my soul and my conscience, because despotism has an ability to do that. Even someone who has been quite deliberate about his commitment to human rights, and uh, when I would compare the way my children would react to life's challenges, would think about their sense of rights, their sense of being, their sense of autonomy, their sense of self-determination, I would see the effect of generational trauma on myself. I mean, it's undeniable. I would see the ways that I see the world in a way tinged with a great deal of anxiety and fear, and um, uh, even a jadedness, if you will. Um, and in a word, um, part of that trauma teaches you to escape from the real difficult moral challenges in life, um, like uh, what, how do you think about the uh, the large life moral questions, like um, the morality and the right to fulfillment that others might claim, or claims of rights that uh, sit uncomfortably with you or challenge your whole sense of moral being, because there are not claims of rights that you're accustomed to thinking about. Um, uh, so the for a lot of American Muslims, what they learn is to escape from having to think about these serious, difficult issues by focusing on what is far more comfortable, que narrow questions, myopic questions of ritual. So, it becomes far more important how you, for a Muslim woman, how to wear the hijab, whether to allow X number of hairs to show from under the hijab that you put on your head, or for a Muslim man to sit there and spend your nights and days thinking about w- how your beard is supposed to look, or how such and such ritual of purification is supposed to be done. And to escape to that type of positivistic approach to law, and to find moral fulfillment in these narrow questions of ritual, and to imagine that this is where God's pleasure is, to that I am going to appease my God by discharging these narrow questions of ritual, uh, and avoid the much harder questions, because despotism teaches you to be a moral coward and an intellectual coward. It teaches you to avoid thinking about questions and issues that will get you into trouble or potential trouble. And so that's, you know, um, uh, the generational challenge is always, if I follow in the footsteps of my parents, I will end up simply caught in the endless cycle of problems that despotism has left us with, was never a step ahead. Um, and that's what I meant by the whole question of, don't don't listen to your parents, because often among American Muslims, what parents teach is become a good doctor, become an engineer, become a lawyer, make a lot of money, and avoid thinking about any moral questions that would potentially possibly get you into trouble. Um, well, that's fine for the kids and the family, but it doesn't bode well for the future of the Islamic faith, or any faith, for that matter.
Dr. Abou El Fadl, it's such an honor to talk to you again. As I said, it reminds me, you to me stand in the in the tradition of Rabbi Heschel, who was asked once by his students when they said, when they were debating whether Jello was kosher, he said, okay, now let's talk about whether the atomic bomb is kosher. So it seems to me it's an honor really to hear your voice. And I think so many of the things that you said will resonate for those of us, regardless of our religious tradition and community, about these questions of wrestling with questions of morality and community, and often the overemphasis on questions of ritual and the minutia of law as opposed to basic questions of human ethics. Um, Thank you so much for doing this.
Peter, thank you, and it's an honor for me to be compared to such a great man. I mean, it's really a towering intellectual figure by all measures, and thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you, and I hope that we'll see each other much more.
I would like that very, very much. I hope everyone has a good weekend, and we will meet again in 2 weeks, but not this coming Friday. Be well.
Thank you. Bye bye.